Baby, 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 baby,
But
baby, baby,
Henry
baby,
himself
baby.
was very generous, and he decided to try to help advance our
Don't
understanding
touch
of
me.
memory by volunteering for countless experiments for decades. In fact, it's quite likely that Henry was tested more than any other neurological patient in history. And
I'm
those
just gonna
studies
put this
taught us a lot of what we know
just to,
about how
man,
memory works.
I can make this work for you, baby.
Now, one of the
That way,
first things that
the
scientists
streamers can just
discovered
see your
was that Henry had
cuteness.
problems remembering events that occurred before the surgery. In particular, he remembered almost no
Deirdre,
events from
what are
the
you
2
doing?
years preceding the surgery, and his memory for the 9 years before that was also impaired. Now, this kind of memory impairment is typically called retrograde amnesia. The term retrograde simply refers to when the forgotten events occurred. So in retrograde amnesia, the forgotten events occurred before the brain damage. But it turns out Henry's most significant deficit was actually in remembering new information that he encountered after his surgery. For example, he was unable to remember the names and faces of the doctors and nurses who took care of him every day. In fact, he typically didn't even recognize them. And so they would have to introduce themselves day after day, despite working with him for years. He could spend hours with a person, engaging in detailed conversations, participating in scientific tests, or sharing a meal. But 5 minutes after their departure, he would typically have no memory for the person or the encounter. And if they came back to visit, Henry would introduce himself and act as if he had never met them before. Because as far as he was concerned, he had. Now, this kind
How do I make this? Darn it.
laying down new memories is often called anterograde amnesia. So in
Gigi,
anterograde
stop
amnesia,
me.
the forgotten events occurred after the surgery, whereas in retrograde amnesia, the forgotten events occurred before. For example, after his operation in 1953, Henry lived with his parents. His father died in 1967, and his mother died in 1981. And Henry then lived in a nursing home. But years later, when asked where he lived, he would typically say that he lived in a house with his mother. And when asked if his father was still alive, he would often say that he wasn't sure, even though his father had died over 20 years earlier. He would sometimes write himself a note as a reminder of his dad's death in an attempt to avoid forgetting this intensely personal memory. Okay,
Gigi.
well, so far we focused on
Gigi,
Henry's
high five.
deficits, but it turns out that many other aspects of learning and memory were actually preserved in Henry.
Treat.
And it was the specific pattern of spared versus impaired functions that taught scientists the most about human memory. So next, let's turn to what Henry could still do, and in particular, what he could still learn. And one of the most important findings was that Henry could still learn skills. For example, you remember how to tie your shoe and how to ride a bike. And you can also learn new skills like playing a new instrument or learning to play golf. And that was also true of Henry. Despite his profound deficit in learning and remembering conscious memories, he could still learn new skills and remember how to perform them. And so can
I want the treats. I don't want to earn them.
In one famous experiment, amnesics were asked to read mirror reversed text, like you see at the top of this slide. Now, this is challenging, but if you practice, you'll get better and better over time. And it turns out that amnesics also improve at reading mirror reversed text the more they practice. So this graph shows how reading time improves with additional practice. The white circles
do the
are
kitty
normal
ups.
control subjects. And
Do
the
them
black
kitty
circles
ups.
are amnesics. And as you can see, the amnesics learn just as quickly as normal control subjects do. Furthermore, they are still good at it 3 months later. So not only do amnesics learn to perform this skill, they also retain this newly acquired ability. But what's amazing is that even though the amnesics get better and better at mirror reading, they typically have no conscious memory of ever having done the task before. So the bottom line is that amnesics can learn perceptual and motor skills just like everyone else. Although they may not consciously remember ever having performed the tasks before, their performance continues to improve with additional practice. Another way of putting it is in terms of remembering how versus remembering that. So amnesics can learn and remember how to perform a skill, even when they don't remember that they ever practiced it before. Now, these kinds of results radically change our understanding of memory and how it's implemented in the brain. At the most general level, they conclusively demonstrate that human beings use multiple different memory systems, depending on what they're learning. In particular, remembering procedural skills is fundamentally different than remembering conscious information, and it even depends on different parts of the brain. After all, amnesia clearly shows that brain damage that dramatically impairs conscious memory can leave skill memory intact. Now, psychologists often refer to conscious memories as declarative, and they refer to skill memory as procedural. So declarative memories
That's
are
not a
memories
chair.
that you can consciously
Fine.
bring to mind and describe verbally. They're called declarative because you can declare them or verbalize them. Now, when most people think of learning a memory, they're thinking of declarative memory. Remembering what you ate for lunch, where you went on your last vacation, and what 2 + 2 is. Those are all examples of declarative memories. Most of the learning that you do when listening to this lecture is also declarative. You can consciously bring the information that you learned to mind, and you can describe it verbally. These are the kinds of memories that amnesics have difficulty learning and remembering.
I just want to do a high five.
Now, in contrast,
Makes me feel good.
memories are memories for motor and cognitive skills. Think of your memory for how to ride a bike or how to tie your shoe.
Yeah, this is
Once you've learned to tie your shoe,
classes.
you really don't have to think about how to do it.
So this is
When you put
memory
on a
class.
tennis shoe, your mind and body take over. You can think about other things
Oh,
or
you know.
hold a conversation while you're tying your shoe. It's an automatic procedural memory. Now, the take-home message
I'll
is
show you where I found it
it's
if you're
important.
interested in it.
Remembering declarative information is fundamentally different than remembering procedural skills. The two types of memory depend on completely different cognitive and neural mechanisms. Now, let's turn to another important characteristic of memory, namely that your memory is constructive. Now, many people have the mistaken idea that their memory is kind of like a video recording. They think that as you go about your day, your memory system is constantly recording all your experiences. And then, when you want to remember something, you just rewind and play back what you experienced. But the truth is that we typically only remember bits and pieces of what we experienced. And when we try to retrieve information from memory, we fill in the missing information with plausible inferences. That's what I mean when I say
Yeah, he did it
memory
up.
is constructive. We build our memories by combining information that we actually experienced with plausible information that we add
Okay,
in.
Kiji. You gotta do this one.
Unfortunately, we
Come.
typically can't tell the difference between what we actually experienced
Gotta do it.
and what we filled in.
Don't you win it?
To illustrate the idea, let's return to those sentences that I read to you at the beginning.
Get up.
I think you might be surprised at what you read.
Come.
Now, what I'm going to do is read a few of those sentences. Well, actually, I'm going to read a few candidate
You can do
sentences, and I
it.
want you to decide if you think each sentence is one that I read earlier
Look at
or
him.
not. Okay, so here's sentence number 1. The ants in the kitchen ate the sweet jelly.
No, in my luck, this one won't upload either.
Decide if you think I read that sentence.
Yes.
Before. Okay? It's number 2. The breeze blowing from the sea stirred the heavy
Yes.
evening air. How about that one? Do you think I read that sentence before?
Yes.
How about sentence number 3? The man read the story in the newspaper.
I'm not sure about that one.
And finally, sentence 4. The breeze stirred the air.
Yes.
Do you think that was one of the sentences that I read? at the
Yes.
beginning? Okay, let's see how you did. Which of those 4 sentences do you think came from the original list? Well, it turns out that the last one did, but not the first three.
Really?
Now, many of you probably thought I had read some of those earlier sentences, but I actually didn't. Only the last sentence was old. All the others were new. And some of you may have thought that I hadn't said the last sentence, even though I did. Now, these materials were from a real experiment that was conducted at the University of Minnesota. They started with 4 relatively complicated sentences, like, the ants in the kitchen ate the sweet jelly which was on the table. They then used these complicated sentences to make up simpler sentences that conveyed one or more of the key ideas from the original. For example, from the complicated sentence up here, they created simpler sentences like, the ants were in the kitchen and the sweet jelly was on the table. Now, these sentences conveyed some of the ideas from the original sentence, but not all of them. And they also varied how many ideas from the original sentence these simpler sentences conveyed. For example, the sentence, the ants were in the kitchen, basically conveys a single idea, while the sentence, the sweet jelly was on the table, conveys 2, namely that the jelly was sweet and that it was on the table. Now, they presented 24 of these sentences to people, and they tested their memory for them about 5 minutes later. Some of the sentences really had been in the original list, but others had not. And then the subjects were asked to give a rating, indicating how confident they were that each sentence was from the original list. Now, you would hope that people would give higher confidence ratings for sentences that were actually old compared with sentences that were new, indicating that they remembered it, right? Wrong. In fact, people gave almost exactly the same ratings for new sentences as they did for old sentences. Essentially, they had almost no idea which sentences were new and which sentences were old.
Thank you, Mom.
Does that mean that they didn't remember anything?
For what?
Not at all.
For joining.
Oh, did it finally go up there?
No, I see somebody in the audience. I have a feeling it's you. So I'm thanking you.
For example, the confidence ratings.
Or it could be Dad. But either way, thank you.
Right now?
Yeesh.
Oh, I'm not. I didn't join. I didn't even know you were doing any session.
Oh, well, it's okay. I just assumed.
Somebody's watching you.
Yay!
And they tended to give negative ratings for test sentences that only conveyed a single idea. And that was true whether the test sentence was new or old.
I gotta wait till you're done, then we'll do another one.
And you may have experienced the same.
Well, are you talking to me?
No, we're doing tricks with the Kitty G.
Same thing. I mean, many people think that they remember the earlier sentences that I read,
Gigi,
but
come.
not the last sentence. Well, it turns out that the last sentence only conveyed a single idea. That last sentence was, the breeze stirred the air. That idea was certainly included in the original list that I read, but it's only a single isolated idea. Now compare that to the first test sentence, which was, the ants in the kitchen ate the sweet jelly which was on the table. Now that sentence conveys 4 ideas. The ants were in the kitchen, the ants ate the jelly was sweet, and the jelly was on the table. So even though that sentence wasn't actually on the original list, it conveys a lot more of the ideas
He's like, I'm done.
from the original list.
Too much
So
food.
naturally, it seems like a better match. Now, there were also a couple of other sentences in the list that I haven't tested yet. But let's test those sentences in a different way. So here are 4 different sentences. And I read one of these sentences to you earlier, but I didn't read the other 3. So sentence 1, he was using a hammer when his father came out to watch him. Sentence 2, he was using a hammer when his mother came out to watch him. Sentence 3, he was screwing in a screw when his father came out to watch him. And finally, sentence 4, he was pounding a nail when his father came out to watch him. Now, which of those 4 sentences do you think I actually said? I suspect that most of you weren't fooled by sentence 2, saying that his mother came out to watch. You may have remembered that it was his father that came out, not his mother. So saying that his mother came out is a change in meaning. And as we've seen, we're pretty good at remembering gist or meaning. Likewise, I doubt that many of you picked sentence 3, saying that he was screwing in a screw. That's also a different meaning, and people are pretty good at ruling that one out. But what about the first sentence? He was using a hammer when his father came out to watch him. I suspect that one was a little harder to reject, and many of you may have actually thought it was the one that I had really said, but it wasn't. Sentence 4 is the original. And notice, it never said anything about a hammer. It said he was pounding a nail. Now, it's obviously pretty likely that he was using a hammer to pound a nail, but that's actually an inference. I mean, it's possible that John was using his shoe to pound the nail. There's nothing in the original sentence to rule that out. So, what can we learn from this example? Well, as we've already discussed, we tend to remember gist or meaning rather than verbatim wording. But it goes beyond that. When we encounter
Fine, I'll just brush you.
we tend to
Little
build
fur
up
baby.
a mental model of what's going on in the situation. In the case
Furry
of John,
baby.
fixing the birdhouse,
He's
we
like, no,
imagine a specific
rejected.
guy working on a specific birdhouse.
Me.
And constructing such a mental model means filling in some of the details that weren't specified. For example, when we hear that he's pounding a nail, we tend to imagine John with a hammer in his hand, since that's the standard tool that we use to pound nails. And it's that mental model that we learn and remember, rather than the original sentences, or even just the gist of the original
Just zoom in on
sentences.
his cute face.
In fact, in a
Wait.
real experiment
Wait.
using these materials, participants
Kitty
were
G.
actually more likely to pick sentence
Never
1
mind.
with the hammer compared to sentence 4.
I'm done with the
without
treats. I
pounding.
already said.
And presumably, that's because they remembered a mental model of the situation, and in that mental model, John was using a hammer. Now, these findings actually have some important real-world implications. Specifically, our legal system often relies on the testimony of eyewitnesses. So a natural question is, just how reliable is eyewitness testimony? Well, let me tell you about some research